Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 110, and the topic is Federating Identity is difficult, expensive, and unnecessary. And a quick reminder are to support the live stream by following us on LinkedIn. And now it's my honor to introduce our guest today, Alan Karp, Distributed Systems Architect, longtime Identity. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
So before we dive into the episode, it's a tradition to ask you to introduce yourself. And so how do you find yourself as a distributed identity architect expert?
It's a long path. I have a PhD in astronomy. I was an assistant professor at Dartmouth. And in my first year, I realized I couldn't write a grant proposal to save my life. It meant I wasn't going to get tenure. So I went over the dark side and did 15 to life at IBM, where I did mostly high performance computing, but I started getting into various aspects of computer architecture. When IBM closed my center, I had a choice: move to Poughkeepsie, New York, or leave the company. And I'd been to Poughkeepsie, New York. So I moved over to HP Labs, where I did a whole bunch of things. I was one of the architects of Intel's Titanium processor. I did a little game theory. We built a platform called eSpeak that was described as web services before there were web services. In my last 10 years at HP Labs, I started working on usable security. We made tools that were easier to use because we added security, not in spite of it, but because of it. Labs eventually came to their senses and kicked me out. But I bamboozled HP Enterprise Services to hire me, where I designed a highly scalable cloud access security broker. But our manager got transferred before we had a chance to build it, and they laid off the whole team. So I tried being retired, and I didn't like it. So I joined a networking startup. And after that folded, I'm now working on a new kind of password manager. It doesn't store your passwords, it calculates them when you need them. So,
Great. And that's a fabulous idea. And I've actually, when my kids were of the age where they started needing passwords, I taught them an algorithmic mechanism to come up with passwords. But I'm sure your algorithmic mechanism is much more secure than the one I thought of.
Well, I have a theorem that any algorithm you can hold in your head is easy to guess.
Yeah.
You want to hear the proof?
Safe to say.
You want to hear the proof of the theorem? Well,
duh. Yeah. And in defense of Poughkeepsie, Poughkeepsie is beautiful. I grew up in New York, and it is a really beautiful place. So
yeah, but it's not.
But I understand your decision to stay in California
it's
too.
Not Palo Alto.
Yeah. No, it is definitely not Palo Alto. You'll find significantly less tech community in Poughkeepsie.
Well, also less snow in Palo Alto.
A lot less, yes. Okay, so the topic today is federating identity is difficult, expensive, and unnecessary. I already wrote in one of my comments, I have to bristle a little bit at this because, Glue is a federation company. We have a federated identity platform. But I think that, federation is such a broad concept. Like we have federation, we have the federal government of the United States. That's a federation that's been pretty successful for the last 100 years and is still standing, at least for now. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what you mean by this, about federated identity in particular.
Yeah, so in the earliest days of computing, and I'm old enough to have lived through this, wrote my first computer program in 1963. So I've seen how the decisions were made. And in the early days, we were very identity centric. You would be given an account identity to log into the computer after we got rid of punch cards. We just kept stretching and that worked okay. But then we got client server. And so we stretched that from a single machine identity to an identity for all the machines in your company, let's say. And even then, it was beginning to show its problems. When I joined HP, my user ID could not be Karp because there was guy Sid Karp in Colorado, and he already had that identity. And we never collaborated, we never met. I don't think we ever worked on the same computer at all. But I had to be a Karp because of this stretching of the identity model to client server.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to the internet and we just stretched that model. And so I would have to get an identity for AOL and another identity for Prodigy and another identity for this one and that one. And that's why you have 87 user IDs and passwords, because we've taken this model that was okay for a single machine and stretched it to the internet. And now as we're going to web services and all, we keep stretching that model. So now I could log into HP, but we've got business partners. And in the early days, those were given an identity within the company. I heard a talk by a guy from Oracle where at one point they had 80,000 employees and were managing 300,000 identities of their business partners. And that clearly wasn't going to work. And so people started this idea of let's federate identities. So instead of logging into Oracle, a contractor would log into his own company, and then they would share that identity. And Oracle would have some access control list, maybe based on identity or role or whatever. But it was the same model we used on the single machine, stretched beyond recognition. And we've boiled the frog. It's the wrong model. We could sort of make it work at each step, but we're beginning to see the real difficulties here. And it turns out that there was another model for access control back in the late 70s, first proposed in the late 60s, that we chose not to use, that would solve this problem much more straightforwardly.
Right, and you're talking about capabilities-based access control.
Correct.
It's funny because you actually sort of gave a concise or sort of a parallel version of like my career trajectory also, because in the 90s I started a company called ID Vault, which nobody remembers or should remember. But it was around extranet management, which isn't even a term anymore. But it was like what you were talking about, how companies had partners and those partners needed identities in their systems, and because they had an extranet which they needed to give them access to,
Right.
and then federated identity happened. So I sort of recognize that trajectory. I think a lot of the millennials weren't around for that awkward teenager extranet period, and they were born into federated, so they don't even remember the pre-federated, like what people did in the 90s
Right.
before federation.
Yeah.
But that's very interesting overview. I wanted to say a couple of words about capabilities-based access control, because you mentioned that it originated from the 60s. I had a thought about innovation recently. I think a lot of people confuse invention and innovation. Um, Innovation is sort of combining things that are out there in a new way. They don't have to be new things, but if you take two things that have never been put together before and put them together, that could be innovative. Whereas invention is inventing new things, and it turns out a lot of companies used universities to generate invention, because invention can be risky and expensive. So in a way, companies are better at innovation than at invention, although certainly some companies also invest in invention, like pharmaceuticals, et cetera. I don't know, IBM doing computing, like organic computing or whatever. But I think what's interesting to me about capabilities-based access control, as you mentioned, is that it might be old, but if we could combine it with some other things, it could still represent innovation. And I'm curious if you have some thoughts on, how could a capabilities-based system represent innovation today? Why would it be innovative today?
Well, I think it would be innovative in the sense that it solves a problem that most people don't even recognize that we have. And the problem is our work is collaborative. And when we collaborate, we have to share permissions. So if I'm going to ask you to help me edit a document, I have to give you permission to edit the document, right? And maybe you need help from somebody else, and so you want to bring them in. And what this is delegation. And in fact, it's chained and attenuated delegation. And that's what's missing from today's systems. In order to add somebody to the project, you have to have a sysadmin to give them the permissions they need to be on the project. You can't just have ad hoc, have them work with you for a day, right, without some big enterprise rigmarole. And so by recognizing the way we work in the physical world works and the way we work in the digital world doesn't, I think capabilities can enable us to do things that would seem impossible today. I have two stories to illustrate this difference. So in the first story, Mark asked me to park his car in my garage. I couldn't do it, so I asked my neighbor to do it for me and said to get the garage key from my son. Now, you wouldn't bat an eye. You wouldn't bat an eye at that story, right?
Yeah.
Second story. In an emergency, Mark asked me to copy a file from his computer to mine. I couldn't do it, so I asked my neighbor to do it for me and said to get access to my computer from my son. Now, that sounds so ridiculous that I've had people laugh when I tell that second story. But it's this difference between how we work in the physical world that isn't supported in the online world. And capabilities can allow us to do that.
Interesting. So, okay. I wanted to actually pivot a little bit. The topic of today's conversation, well, just to give a little background, actually, this episode was supposed to be Daniel Fett. So if you're still expecting, if you notice that Alan is somewhat older than Daniel Fett, we had to switch Daniel to sometime later. He's going to be coming up at the end of July. And today, because Daniel was absent, we sort of had an opportunity to slide in an episode about a recent article that I wrote that got a lot of impressions on LinkedIn. It was a response to an article from the CISO of JP Morgan Chase, Pat Opet. And I want to read, before we dig more deeper into capabilities, I want to read a snippet from his original open letter to third parties, vendors. And this is sort of a long passage, so I don't normally do this, but bear with me for a second. So the letter starts, SaaS models are fundamentally reshaping how companies integrate services and data. Modern integration patterns dismantle these essential boundaries, relying heavily on modern identity protocols like OAuth to create a direct, often unchecked interactions between third-party services and firms' sensitive internal resources. In practice, these integration models collapse authentication, verifying identity, and authorization, granting permissions, into an overly simplified interactions, effectively creating single-factor explicit trust between systems on the internet and private internal resources. This architectural regression undermines fundamental security principles that have proven durable. That is sort of the background, and I think what he's saying here is that we're attempting to do some of these more complicated delegations, and the systems that we have just aren't working. And I thought that aligns well with your idea of federated identity, is not sort of working as the core of our security system. But maybe you could just comment a little bit about this. Is this what you're getting at by saying that federated identity is difficult, expensive, and unnecessary?
Yes, but we are trying to solve a modern problem using an ancient technology. And it doesn't quite work, but we accept its failures because we don't know any better. I have a paper that we wrote called ZBAC, which explains this model of enterprise to enterprise sharing and how it could be done that doesn't involve federating identity. And the basic idea is when my company signs a contract with Glue to use some of Glue's services, you simply create a capability that grants an agent in my company. We have an assigned person that you would grant it to, assigned public key you would grant it to, listing all the permissions covered by the contract. In my company, that person would delegate, say, to the department head that was responsible for working on that contract. That department head would delegate to the individual managers the subset of permissions they need, and they would delegate to the employees who were doing the work. When the employees came to Glue to use those services, they would simply present proof that they were authorized to do that via this delegation chain. Their identity wouldn't matter in making the access decision. Of course, it would be there for audit purposes, but if you heard that Sam Smith was the person who did, Sam Smith at my company who did this, you have no clue who that is. It's just a name. You didn't vet that person. You have no way of knowing who it is. You would have to go through my company anyway to find out. So if Sam Smith did something you didn't like, you'd have no way to, throw Sam in jail. You'd have to tell my company that Sam did something, and then it would be up to us, people in my company, to deal with it. And so this idea of attenuated delegation chains solves the problem that federated identity is trying to solve but does poorly.
So let me break that apart a little bit. You're saying that instead of delegating to a person, we're going to delegate the capability. So we're going to say, I have this capability to do X, and within my company, I might delegate that capability to somebody who's actually going to do it. Mm-hmm. And then that person actually does it, in the Glue domain, and then I can reference back the person who actually performed it in your domain. But I don't care who did it as long as that person can show that they have been granted that capability.
That's right. That's
okay.
Right. And so that becomes dramatically simpler.
So let's tie it back to so in OAuth, when before the call started, and we were discussing how there's a new OAuth standard that tries to address chaining from domain A to domain B, and so the idea in that situation is that a person authenticates in domain A, and they want to do an action in domain B, and so in this new OAuth chaining draft, what happens is that the application trades the token from A and gets a new token in B, and then presents the token in B to the service in domain B. And my question on last week's live stream was, why can't the service in domain A just call the service in domain B and present the token in domain A and say, here's the identity of the person. As long as you trust my domain's issuance of that token, you can trust this token. But you feel like that's actually not a good match or that's still a flawed design.
Right. That runs into a vulnerability called the confused deputy. It's not really relevant to the federated identity, but it's another reason to use capabilities. The thing about a capability is that it combines designation with authorization. So my definition of a capability is it's an unforgeable, transferable permission to use the thing it designates. And by combining the designation with authorization, you prevent the kind of problem that can happen with Norm Hardy's confused deputy vulnerability. And that's actually everywhere. So cross-site request forgery is a confused deputy vulnerability. Clickjacking is a confused deputy vulnerability. And you can avoid it by using capabilities. It's not really relevant to the topic of federating identities, but it is the weakness in using the identity, because typically an identity carries many permissions.
Right.
And there's no way in an identity-based system to say, I want to use this permission for this argument in the call, in the API, and that permission in this argument, right? There's just no way to express that because your identity carries all your permissions. They're sort of ambient in your environment. And this leads to vulnerabilities like confused deputy. It's harder to enforce least privilege. This is where you get into role explosion as people try to enforce least privilege. And ultimately, it just collapses under its own weight. Whereas with a capability, by combining the designation with authorization, a lot of these things become simple.
Right. So even if we trade our token from domain A for a domain B token, we can't control what capability that service in domain A is requesting with that domain B token.
Well, I like to use the word permissions because capability is an overloaded word. We take it to mean functionality. In this discussion, we've been using it to mean an authorization of some sort. Mark Miller tried to avoid that by using the term OCAP, object capability. It's not object and object-oriented programming. It's object in the sense of the subject-object model.
Right.
This person has access to that file, the subject and the object. And if you represent that as a token, Alice would have a token that says she's authorized to read file foo. And so we use the term OCAP because you actually just use capability in another more commonly used meaning of functionality. So
right. But the challenge is that because we're passing a token about a person with no relationship to their permissions or the specific permission we're trying to authorize, there's no way to prevent the service from maybe presenting it to a different service. That's where you get the confused deputy problem, where we thought we were giving you this token so you could call service 1, but you're now using this token to call service 2.
No, that's not the confused deputy. So in the confused deputy, you've asked me to do something on your behalf. And so you name some resource. When I go to do that thing on your behalf, I'm necessarily meaning using my permissions on the resource that you named.
Okay.
Right? And you may not have permission to write it, but I may. And if I do, I may have violated the rules, right? And so that's the reason for the confused deputy. If you used a capability, you would delegate to me your capability. And since you don't have write permission, you could only delegate read permission. And if you tricked me into writing, it would fail because the capability wouldn't authorize write.
Right. So this is why we want the web server not to run as root when it's running CGI scripts.
Right. But now we can go to arbitrarily fine granularity because the capabilities can be just as fine as granularity as you want. By the way, have you ever used a capability system?
I'm not sure that I have. I was just about to ask you if I've heard of capabilities-based operating systems, but I'm not sure that I've used any of them. And I was going to ask you about that. So what are some of the examples of capabilities-based systems that are out there today?
Well, have you ever brought your car into the shop for repairs?
Yes.
Did you enter
too often? Yeah.
Did you enter the technician's identity into the access control list for your car?
No, I did not.
You gave him that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. This is a unforgeable, transferable permission to drive my car. It's a capability. Have you ever used a Google Doc?
Sure.
With the unguessable URL. So that's replacing unguessability for unforgeability, but it's effectively the same thing. It's a capability. It designates the object and grants you permission to. So we've been using capabilities all over the place. Now, there are several places. Digital Bazaar has capabilities in production use and has for quite a while now. The capability-based operating systems, there's the Cherry project out of SRI in Britain, and the SEL4 Linux effort. Those are capability-based systems. So yes, capabilities are being used in production, but too often we are stuck with doing things the way we knew how to do them in 1970.
And what are some of the objections that people have today against using capabilities-based access control?
Yeah, so the main one is you've lost control, because if you give me a capability, I can delegate it to somebody else.
Right.
But that control that you thought you had was an illusion, because if I can't delegate a subset of my permissions, I'll just share my credentials, my private key or my login credentials. And that is so common a problem that Ping Identity runs a webinar on how to tell teach your employees not to share their login credentials. But sometimes it's the only way you can get your work done. So at HP, in the employee manual, it was explicit that sharing your password with anybody except IT support was a fireable offense. And yet every manager shared her login credentials with her admin, because that was the only way she could get her work done.
Right.
Rather than simply giving permissions. And, and in fact, in the real world, I just did my taxes with TurboTax. Last year, when they wanted to download my tax forms, they asked me for my bank login credentials. And I, of course, didn't do that. This year, they got an OAuth token granting them permission to download just my tax forms. That's a capability. So I delegated a capability to them.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to note on the credential sharing, the one that that society has never figured out how to solve is healthcare. Most healthcare firms have a web portal, and there's no way they don't use two-factor authentication, because then there'd be no way that you could share the credentials. So how would your child or your spouse log in to get your reports? So I do think this is a common solution, is to just share your credentials.
Yeah. Well, back in 2008, New York State was working on a online health records project, and I was reviewing their stuff, and they didn't have delegation, and they're getting very close to the end, and so I showed them how to do this with capabilities, and they adopted it. Unfortunately, the financial crisis hit and the project got terminated. But it would have been in production in New York had that not happened, probably.
Do you think that if we were to move to a capabilities-based authorization model, this would help us with detection? Basically, how detecting threats is how would a capability system enable you to better detect threats than an identity-based system?
Probably wouldn't. What it would do is it would allow you to more easily enforce least privilege. My personal philosophy when designing the security for a system is the attacker is smarter than me, and the attack will succeed. And my goal is to limit the damage as much as I can. So we built a prototype system for Microsoft Windows XP actually, a virus-safe environment for Windows XP, where you got the virus ran, and it did so little harm you didn't care. So we didn't detect, we didn't block the attacks. We just made sure that the attacker could gain so little privilege that he couldn't do any harm. So for example, if your spreadsheet had a macro virus, the only file it had permission to edit was itself. So you didn't care.
So a lot of software today is moving to SaaS. Um, Software vendors don't even want to sell you anything other than SaaS. And this has created new challenges because we used to have a boundary around our organization, and now the boundary has been open to third parties and potentially to fourth parties because those SaaS providers might be using other systems. Um, what do you think SaaS providers would have to do um, to improve their securities or to move to a capabilities-based system in order to better secure their services?
Well, this was exactly the key point of the cloud access security broker that I was designing. That companies, HP had this problem. They had 1,000 enterprise customers with tens of thousands of employees each, and they were using all these cloud services, and the companies had no control over it. And so we designed a system where, based on basically OAuth bearer tokens was the bottom technology, um, where we would use that so that each employee got the least privilege, and we were able to revoke access very easily. Um, and for services that were OAuth aware, like Salesforce, it was very straightforward to implement it. For legacy services, we had to build a per service proxy, which was a big deal. But HP had, these customers would pay enough money that HP could do it. But I would simply say, adopt the authorization first model. That when a request comes into your service, the first question you ask is this request authorized? And you do that by looking at some credential. It could be an OAuth, just random string of characters kind of thing, or it could be a digital certificate like a JWT. It could be TBAC. The thing I like about TBAC is that which is your proposal, which I hadn't thought of, but I like one feature I like about it is somebody has delegated to me a permission. I want to delegate it to somebody else, but attach some policy to it that others know how to interpret, but wouldn't necessarily know to impose themselves. So, for example, this thing is valid unless the US is at war with Canada. Now, that used to be funny, but
Still funny, I
yeah.
hope.
But and then when the service request is finally made, the PDP or whatever is evaluating whether the request matches the token could evaluate that policy. That's a very nice feature of TBAC that I don't think the other systems I know of can implement. So, but
Yeah.
the point is that you go authorization first, not identity first.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about this, and today a lot of systems, a lot of SaaS systems use groups, right? In fact, had a good conversation. Dick Hart and um, um, anyway is proposing a new standard to allow the IDP to provision. RPs, or to say, okay, and one of the most important things that they've identified is that an IDP like Okta needs to say, here's this group, and then the SaaS provider can say, okay, I'm going to map the groups to a role and the role to capabilities. And that's sort of the standard way about how access management. So it's your membership of a group basically determines what you can do in the application. But what you can do is actually never exposed by the application, by the SaaS provider. That mapping of role or group to capabilities happens in the SaaS provider, but is never actually exposed to the company that's using the SaaS provider. Um, so, in your view, would this model change? So, where the SaaS provider would maybe expose up the capabilities, um, or would it, or would it, or would you still use the same approach where the application is responsible for maintaining that mapping?
Well, so I don't know that. I haven't seen that specific model, but the way it typically works is you have a role, and they do, when you make a request, they look up in an access control list to see if somebody in this role can carry out this action.
Right.
That's the standard approach. And that, again, has the confused deputy vulnerability. It leads you to try to federate identities. Roles don't match across enterprises. There's a funny story about the DoD called the 13+1 problem, where they tried to define a set of roles that everybody in the DoD could, actually a set of attributes to define roles that everybody would agree on. They could only come up with 13 of them, which was clearly an accident. But yeah, so, but I think the right way to do it is, again, my company has to have some sort of contract with the SaaS provider, otherwise they wouldn't get paid. So there's some relationship there. And the way it should work is my company uses its own internal authentication and permission system, whether it's roles, attributes, whatever. And so I would authenticate to my company, and what I would get is a bundle of capabilities. And when I want to use that SaaS service, I take my capability for that SaaS service, I delegate a subset of my permissions to the software that's going to invoke the SaaS service. And the SaaS service only cares that the token authorizes the request I'm making. That's it. And it's so much simpler.
It seems to me like the fact that the capabilities are hidden by the SaaS provider means that the company using the SaaS provider can't really understand what those policies are. And the only way that they have, that they're offered to solve these, to solve access to these capabilities is by sending groups or roles. And so it seems like a better approach would be if the SaaS provider actually exposed the capabilities and maybe disclose their policies. You know, here's the policies under which we will grant access to these capabilities. And one of those policies could be you present a token that shows that you're a member, that you have this role or your membership of the group.
No,
So
now you're going back to the authentication-based approach. No, what they do is they create a bunch of capabilities and delegate them to my company. My company will delegate subsets to me, and then I simply present them to the SaaS provider. Now, the SaaS provider may have rules. It might say only people who've gone through our training program should use this capability. They can't enforce that, but it could be a contract violation if my company didn't support that. But no, any authentication I do is within my company.
Yeah.
And I simply get a bundle of capabilities that I can delegate to software running on my behalf.
Yeah, what you're saying is interesting. I think it's doable. So it might require more work by the company because you're saying that instead of actually, my view was that the SaaS provider would still be executing the policy. But what you're saying is if the SaaS provider exposes the capabilities, then maybe the company has a mirror of those capabilities and then evaluates its policies about whether it should grant that capability, then says, okay, we're granting you the ability to perform this this capability on the SaaS provider. Here's a token that represents that.
Yep.
And then the SaaS provider would have a very simple policy that all it would say is look for a token that says that whoever's asking for this has this capability. So you're separating you're moving the policy from the from the SaaS provider to the company, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now you slipped into identity thinking when you said who. It's just that this request matches the capability that's presented with it. In other words, it's authorizing this particular request, regardless of who submitted it. The SaaS provider doesn't need to know who. They'll report it for audit purposes, but it's not part of the access decision.
Right. Yeah, they only need to be able to reference, basically, it has to be referenceable back, but they don't actually maybe even need to know who.
That's right. And in fact, the Department of Defense, the Navy, love that because in the delegation chain, knowing who created an order is useful information for the enemy. So the Navy simply replaced these with opaque identifiers that only the Navy could map to individuals.
Sure, reference IDs back to the to the audit log. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, that is interesting. It would require a big change in the SaaS industry to move to this new model.
Companies are, as I said, Salesforce already supports it. When we looked, I've forgotten the numbers now because it was a long time ago, but it was something like a third of the SaaS providers that we were going to support already supported OAuth as OAuth bearer authorization tokens.
Yeah.
Not identity tokens, authorization tokens.
Yeah. Right. And in my theory for TBAC, there's a lot of different types of tokens. Part of the challenge of tokens is that there's like 20 different types of tokens today, all representing different things. Yeah. Some of them representing identity and some of them not.
Yeah, that's right. And it depends on your requirements as well, because we designed a system for HP that was very high volume, 10,000 requests per second. Now, you're not going to do digital signatures at 10,000 requests per second, right? So we designed a system using just opaque strings, and the validation was a hash table lookup. Just a sequence of a few hash table, one lookup per delegation in the chain, and that was very fast. But you can do much more if you have digital certificates where you can embed additional information. But,
right. Or tokens, let's say. So certificates implies X509 certificates, but we're probably talking about JWTs. The 10,000 transactions per, that's an interesting number, by the way, because, just referencing back to the Cedarling, which is my frame of reference, if we can do 20 transactions per millisecond, that's 20,000 transactions per second. So maybe it's not so impossible today.
Yeah. Well, this was more than 10 years ago.
Yeah. So let's go to last thoughts. What should people be thinking about, or what action items or anything else you want to promote? Your new password thing.
Well, I think people should turn their brains inside out and stop putting identity first. Think about authorization. Think about least privilege and how you enforce it. Think about chained delegation, which is really a requirement, but that today people simply ignore because they don't know how to implement it. And look at the technologies that are out there. There's there's GNAP coming out. There's UCAN. That's one form of certificate capabilities. There's ZCAP LD. That's another form. Play with it. See how it works. Recognize the need for chained attenuated delegation and see how you would integrate it into your systems. And when you find yourself saying who, stop and think. So how's that?
Perfect. Yeah, I think very, very timely. And I think the call to action for innovation is really needed. We do need to whatever we're doing now is not working. That's actually my core starting point. Is like we've hit the limit on authorization centered around identity. I think that's clear. Okay, well, good conversation. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining me. Next episode, we have two really experienced integrators who are going to talk about lessons learned in IAM. And with that, we will say goodbye to the audience. Thank you again, Alan, and see you next time.
Okay, bye.